Can everybody see the screen okay, the slides?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay. Great, so thanks so much for the invitation. It's a lot of fun to remotely tell you about this project. I wanted to start out by giving you a very brief overview of this autism center that we've created in Israel. We're very excited to have Azrielli join the name of the center. This is just a recent donation that happened this year and is really allowing us to expand this national effort to the major part of this effort is basically to collect data about as many individuals with autism as possible in the country. And I'll focus on the early diagnosis project, but I'm going to show you a couple of slides about the center. So this national center started out with a grant from the Israeli Ministry of Science and Technology, and that happened in 2018, 3 years ago. And it was really the first time that the Israeli government appreciated that we need national infrastructure to do autism research. And we're very proud to have won it and created this at Ben-Gurion University in the south of Israel, in Beersheba. What you see here is a picture of one of the autism conferences. We're having another conference in 2 weeks. And part of the agenda is really to create a community in Israel and to do research together that's all based on a national database. And the idea is that in order to do meaningful research on autism these days, it's really important to switch from working in individual labs and doing more collaborative work together on large populations with a focus on longitudinal research. And you'll, I think, appreciate the longitudinal aspect when we start talking about early diagnosis and why it's important. And another really important aspect is bridging the gap between the clinic and science. And so we spend a lot of time persuading clinicians to collaborate with scientists and vice versa in order to answer questions that are clinically meaningful. And so today we operate in a lot of centers that do autism diagnosis in Israel. We cover the entire southern half of Israel. We're located in Beersheba. These are the 4 child development centers that cover the southern half of Israel. So Israel has a social healthcare system, which is very useful for us. We implement the research inside the actual clinical settings, inside the child development center. So we have research assistants that are integrated into the teams that actually do the diagnosis. And this has enabled us to recruit a very large number of families into this national database that we've created. If you're interested in more details about that, we published a paper a couple of years ago about the types of data and the scientific questions that they're supposed to answer. They're all in this paper. And to give you kind of an overview of the database, you can get a feeling for the types of information that we've collected. We're now already at about 1,200 kids with autism. Most of them are below the age of 8 years old, where we have data about their ADOS and cognitive and language assessments and questionnaires about sleep habits and sensory difficulties and things like that. I think we have one of the biggest repositories of audio and video recordings, which we use a lot for research with computer scientists and biomedical engineers. We try to look at early signs of autism and identify symptoms using machine learning and things like computer vision algorithms and speech analysis algorithms. And another interesting part here is if you go down to the lower numbers, you'll see that we have several hundred kids for whom we have follow-up data. So these are children who come back to the social healthcare system for an annual follow-up. And that gives us an opportunity to, again, measure their symptom severity and collect a bunch of different types of data in a longitudinal manner and allows us to start thinking or looking at how, at how symptoms develop over time and at trajectories of development, if you like. And then we can combine that with other types of studies like eye tracking, genetics. We're also doing some EEG and neuroimaging, but I won't tell you about that. Those are smaller numbers in selected samples here. And so the idea with this database is that we're trying to make it openly available to all the researchers in Israel and have it be a source for research that allows for collaborations across disciplines, for example, like genetics and neuroimaging and behavioral work and so forth. So the main agenda for today is this paper that we just published about the importance of early diagnosis. And what we did there is we wanted to take a look at children who are diagnosed in Israel and that we've been able to follow up for a period of a year or two and try and see how important is actually the age of diagnosis. So there's large variability. There are many reasons for why children might be diagnosed. Some children might be diagnosed earlier than others. And when you talk to clinicians, it's not necessarily clear how important they think it is. It's very difficult to talk about prognosis in autism and whether, there aren't very clear measures of children who might do better than others or predictors of outcome. And so that's the main motivation for this project. So when we looked at kids who had this follow-up, what I'm showing you here is a graph that demonstrates the score on the first ADOS. Here I'm showing you the raw ADOS score. We'll switch to the calibrated scores in a minute. So here you see the raw score during the first visit at diagnosis and then a year or two later. And you can get a feeling for the change over time. If the score remains the same, the children will fall along this diagonal. If they improve, the points will fall below. So each point here is a different child. Okay, so here you see a child that had a very high score during their initial diagnosis and then a very low score at the follow-up later on. And you get this optimistic picture that many of the children get better with their ADOS scores, right? And I assume that most of you are familiar with the ADOS, but just in case you're not, the ADOS is basically a set of tasks, about 32 tasks or games that a clinician plays with the child, tries to interact with them, and then scores each one of them on a scale of 0 to 2. And the higher the number on the score, the more core autism symptoms are evident in this interaction. So it will include things like the amount of eye contact that the clinician felt the child was exhibiting, the amount of initiations that the child made to play with the clinician, the amount of responses, so all sorts of items like that. So you get this optimistic result that most of the kids are getting better at these social communication and some repetitive behavior items. And so the project that we looked at here was to try and determine how that was related to the age of their diagnosis. And so we chose to break down the group. We're looking at 130 kids here, by the way, who are between 1 and 6 years old at the time of diagnosis. And we broke them down into a group of kids who are younger than 2.5 years old or older than 2.5 years old. The reason we selected 2.5 years is because that's the upper limit of most of the screening tools for early identification of autism. So if you look at the MCHAT and all sorts of tools like that, and at the American Academy of Pediatric recommendations, they usually recommend screening for autism at this age. And so, so here again, you see the same data, but now in these calibrated severity scores that allow you to compare autism symptoms across kids who are at different ages, right? Because the autistic symptoms at the age of 1 are going to be different from those at the age of 6. And the calibrated severity score puts you on the same playing field in order to be able to compare kids of different ages. We took a very wide gap here in deciding how to classify kids as those who are improving versus deteriorating. So you see that we have this, we consider changes that were larger than 2 points on the CSS, which are pretty major changes as improvements or deterioration, and anything that fell within that 2-point boundary, we considered as static, is not changing much. So here you see the difference in age groups. Again, you see this dramatic difference in that younger children are improving more than the children who were diagnosed at older ages, right? So the age of diagnosis seems to be playing an important factor here. And a really interesting finding is that this improvement is being driven not by differences in repetitive behavior symptoms. So with the ADOS, we can separate the items that go into the repetitive and restrictive symptoms score from the items that go into the social communication score, right? So the RRB scores are not changing in this young group and barely changing in the older group, but the dramatic changes in the social communication symptoms. And this is really where you get this huge impact of early identification. And hopefully what's happening here is that these younger kids are being identified early, getting treatment early. We'll talk about treatment in a moment. And then you get this evidence of much better outcome and much more progress in the ability to communicate socially. So just to put that in quantitative measure, that we're talking about 3 times more improvement in, or I should say different, your chance of improving more than 2 points on the ADOS CSS are 3 times larger if you were diagnosed before the age of 2.5. Okay, so about a little over 60% of the kids in the younger group are improving more than 2 points versus about something like 20% in the older group. Another way of visualizing this or looking at this data is just by looking at a scatter plot that shows you the change in the ADOS score versus the age of first diagnosis. And you can get this very clear image of how the younger ages are just changing much more dramatically than the older ages, the kids who were diagnosed earlier. Here you see again that breakdown of the social symptoms where this becomes even more dramatic, right? The younger ones are improving much more. A negative change here is improvement. But with the repetitive behaviors, the line is almost flat. It even takes an opposite slope, which says something about the trajectory of these different symptoms that while we see dramatic improvement in the social symptoms, we even see a sort of deterioration or maybe an emergence of more repetitive and restricted behaviors with age at these younger ages. We were very careful to perform several control analyses to demonstrate that these changes in core symptoms are not just a function of, I should start this differently. So you might assume that kids who are diagnosed earlier might have more severe symptoms, and you'd be right about that. And so we wanted to ensure that the conclusions that we're making here about the age of diagnosis are not specifically tied to any of the initial criteria of the participating children. And so what we did in the study is that we carefully selected subgroups of children who were matched on all of the criteria that we could control, which were basically cognitive function, the initial severity of symptoms according to ADOS scores, the gender, the sex of the participants. I think that's it. And even when we match on all of these initial criteria, we still get the same picture of kids being diagnosed early here in these black bars, demonstrating much larger negative changes here are improvement. Okay, so much larger improvements in ADOS scores, and particularly in these social symptoms, in comparison to the children who were diagnosed later, who are in the gray bars here. We get the same when we simply split the group according to gender. In both females and males, you see the same picture with these large improvements in the black bars here, where the children who were diagnosed earlier, relative to the gray bars, the children who were diagnosed later. An interesting finding was that in both groups, when we look at what you see here is a scatter plot of the in the x-axis, the change in ADOS over time. So the negative scores here are improvement versus their initial ADOS score. And we see that the kids who start out with more severe symptoms, regardless of whether they're younger or older, tend to improve more. So there seems to be more room for improvement, perhaps, in children who start out with more severe symptoms, and more opportunity for perhaps for the intervention to create some positive changes. Interestingly, the cognitive scores of the kids didn't matter at all in either group. So we didn't have cognitive scores for all of the children participating here. It's about 80% of the group, and we find no relationship in terms of improvement relative to the initial cognitive abilities. So if we go back to that initial slide with the questions that we started out with, so early diagnosis seems to be very important. The critical age here seems to be around 2.5 years old, with kids who are diagnosed before this age improving much more particularly in their social communication abilities relative to kids who are diagnosed after this age. And quantifying this demonstrates that the kids are about 3 times as likely to make improvement. Okay, this would actually, we could either break now for a couple of questions. Oh, you like the questions at the end. Okay. Okay, so I'll switch over and tell you about another project for another 10 minutes, and then we'll take questions about both. So this project gives us one viewpoint of what's important in terms of early outcomes, and that's the age of diagnosis. The other obvious place to look is at the intervention. What did these children receive? And our children at younger ages, maybe could they be receiving more intervention, or you could think of different types of intervention, and so forth. So we're following up that project with a couple of other projects where we're looking at longitudinal data from children, and we're contrasting kids who are placed in mainstream education versus kids in special education. So in Israel, we have this very strong dichotomy between kids who are in the special education kindergarten, where only 8 children where each class is composed of only 8 children, and they get a lot of intervention from a more professional staff that usually includes special education, kindergarten teachers, and speech therapists, and what do you call it? Blanking out on the professions. So the
occupational therapy.
Occupational therapists, thank you, and so forth. And so kids in special kindergartens usually get something like 10 hours a week of one-on-one interventions. And the alternative is to go to mainstream education, where a lot of the kids are accompanied by an aide, but this personal aide will not have much professional background and will typically not perform very structured interventions or something like that with the kids. And so in Israel, about 2/3 of the children go to special education and 1/3 are in mainstream education. And you might ask yourself, okay, what are the criteria for going to one setting versus the other? So we looked at that. In Israel, the bottom line is basically that the parents decide where to send the children. And when we compared the cognitive scores and the ADOS scores of children placed, this is a pretty large group of 242 kids placed in the south of Israel, we find that there's a very large overlap in their scores, both cognitive and ADOS scores, which seem to show that children with very similar cognitive abilities can be in either setting, and with different autism severities can also be in either setting. The overlap is very clear in daycare centers, which are kids who are 2 or 3 years old. In kindergartens, where they're 4 or 5 years old, you start seeing more larger differences, particularly in cognitive scores, but they go up to 7 points, which is about half a standard deviation on the cognitive scale. So these are not large differences. Language is also not a big difference across settings. You can see it here in kids who were diagnosed with the toddler module of the ADOS, where language level is determined according to there are 4 levels. So this is a gross analysis of language. There's a bit of difference in the language in kindergarten. You can see difference in the modules. The Model 2 kids are more verbal than the children who were diagnosed with Module 1, but still there's a lot of overlap. And so with some of these kids, we were able to, with about half of them, we were able to follow them up for a year and then run the same cognitive and ADOS assessments at the end of the year and compare 85 kids who were in special education versus 36 who were in mainstream. And what I'm plotting here on the y-axis are the change in the ADOS scores, right? And you can see that in the total ADOS score, notice this variability. Some of the children are improving a lot and others are deteriorating in terms of their, the severity of symptoms here. But there seems to be similar distributions in both settings. So it seems that it doesn't really matter whether the child is in special education versus mainstream education as far as ADOS scores go. And even when we break that down to the social communication part versus the repetitive behaviors, there are no differences across the groups. It's nice to see that kids improve in both settings with their social abilities. And the same is true with language abilities. So here again is the entire sample and a matched subgroup that is similar to what I described before. We see similar improvements in both settings and at least no statistically significant difference across settings. And this is very, I just want to emphasize again the difference between the settings. So the children here are getting dramatically different scopes of interventions and amount of interventions, right? The special education kids have this advantage that they're getting a lot of one-on-one hours The mainstream education kids have an advantage that they're surrounded by typically developing kids and are able to perhaps participate in a lot more interactions with typically developing children. And it seems that some of the kids are improving in either setting and some of the kids are deteriorating in either setting. When we look at either setting, we again looked at the relationship with the age of diagnosis. We see what I showed you in the first project, the importance of early diagnosis for improvement. And we get the same results regardless of whether we look at children in mainstream or special education. Age has a similar correlation in both. And so that's the main finding. I just wanted to mention that when you look at outcome in all the projects that I've shown you so far, we focused almost entirely on the ADOS assessment, right? Which is just one form of outcome. And there are, of course, other very important forms of outcome. Most important one is probably adaptive behavior, which seeks to measure the independence of the child and the ability to perform daily activities and things like that, which might be one of the most important things for achieving later independence. We didn't look at that. We don't know if there are differences across the educational settings in those developmental trajectories. And also aberrant behaviors, right? How irritable the child is and measures like that we didn't examine. That might be a predictor of whether some kids go into special education systems versus mainstream education. We didn't do a longitudinal follow-up of cognitive abilities, and we didn't do a very precise examination of language ability. We only looked at the gross language changes that we can see as part of the ADOS assessment. And so those are all projects that are now underway with additional cohorts as we enlarge this national database and are able to look at more and more kids. So that's the main message. I think I don't think I need to expand much about how important this is for making decisions about public policy and education systems and determining whether funds are being allocated in the best and the optimal way right now, or whether changes need to be made. And there's, of course, a very important part of, today there aren't clear recommendations for families as to whether to, how to place their children. It's not that if there are certain criteria that clinicians today tell parents that they should prefer special education or mainstream education. So there's a lot to do here in order to create more recommendations with prognostic value of where children are going to do better and achieve more of their potential and independence and so forth. I'd like to thank Michal Ilan and Itzan Gabay, who are two amazing graduate students who did most of the work that you just saw. And of course, the entire Autism Center. This is a big group effort. And thank you for listening.